Bismillah-ir-Rahman-ir-Rahim. Welcome to the Missing Dots. For over a century, a movement born in the shadows of colonial India has claimed a place within Islam, while the global Muslim scholarly consensus rejects that claim, creating one of the most controversial chapters in modern religious history. A movement shaped by political turmoil, theological disputes, and global migration, now expanding rapidly across the UK, Europe, and the West, using polished narratives, humanitarian branding, and youth-focused outreach to present itself as a misunderstood sect. And tonight, we investigate its origins, its doctrines, its rise, and the questions every young Muslim must understand before being swept into its carefully crafted message. Because this is not about debate or emotion, but about evidence, history, and the missing dots that reveal the full picture.
You know, just sitting out here in the courtyard right now,
Yeah.
just listening to the evening kind of settle down after prayer.
It's really peaceful.
It is, and it actually gives us the perfect frame of mind for what we need to talk about today, because people usually approach this subject with like raised voices and a lot of heat.
Oh, absolutely. A ton of emotion.
Right, but we really need to leave that heat at the door. Tonight, we're just looking at the history. We're reading the primary texts, looking at the theology, and, observing the sociology of it all.
No sectarian attacks.
Exactly. No emotion. We are just placing the evidence on the table and looking at it honestly.
And if you are listening to us right now, I just want you to pull up a chair and sit in this quiet courtyard with us. We're not here to preach at you.
No, not at all.
We're really just trying to understand a deeply complex phenomenon. But to truly grasp the Ahmadiyya movement, we have to travel far away from where we are sitting right now.
Yeah, we have to go back in time.
Right back to the dust, the tension, and honestly, the intense anxiety of late 19th century Punjab.
In colonial India.
Exactly.
And grasping the birth of this movement, it really requires us to feel the psychological weight of that specific time and place.
It was a heavy time.
Incredibly heavy. Just picture the Muslim community in India during the late 1800s. We are looking at the decades immediately following the 1857 mutiny.
Which some historians call the First War of Independence, right?
Yeah, they do. But whatever name you give it, the failure of that uprising was a shattering, just a completely traumatic blow to the Muslims of the subcontinent.
Because they lost everything.
Right. The Mughal political authority had been eroding for generations anyway, but 1857 was the final official end. The British Crown just stepped in and took absolute direct control.
And that level of trauma, it's actually hard for us to conceptualize today. Because for hundreds of years, Muslims in the subcontinent had been the ruling class.
They were the elite.
Yeah, the political elite, the administrators, the landowners. And suddenly they find themselves not just militarily defeated, but just entirely sidelined.
And viewed with intense suspicion by the British authorities.
Exactly. The British were actively stripping them of their economic and political power. They even shifted the official language of administration from Persian to English.
Which is a huge blow. It just invalidates the entire traditional education system overnight.
Right. The traditional Islamic education systems were defunded. It was an absolute crisis of identity.
An epistemological crisis, truly. When your entire societal structure collapses like that, you start to question how you know what you know.
You doubt your place in the world.
Yeah. And nature abhors a vacuum.
Okay.
Right. So into this space of political despair and spiritual vulnerability, several incredibly aggressive forces arrived.
Like the missionaries.
Yes. The British colonial administration brought with them a flood of Christian missionaries. And these were not just quiet individuals building schools and hospitals.
They were militant.
Highly aggressive. They were actively, publicly standing in the bazaars and debating Muslim scholars, publishing tracts attacking the character of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And questioning the divine origin of the Quran.
Exactly. But the pressure was coming from multiple directions. It wasn't just the British or the Christian missionaries.
Right, because the Hindu revivalist movements were also finding their footing in this chaotic environment.
Yeah, the Arya Samaj is probably the most prominent example, founded around 1875, I think, by Dayananda Saraswati.
And they were fiercely advocating for a purified, reformed Hinduism.
Extremely fierce. They were highly aggressive in their polemics against both Islam and Christianity. They initiated this process called Shuddhi.
What was that exactly?
It was a formalized attempt to basically reconvert Muslims back to Hinduism, so the Muslim community in Punjab just felt totally besieged.
Taking fire from all sides.
Right, from the British administration, the Christian missionaries, the Arya Samaj, and internally they were splintering too.
Because you had the traditionalists and the modernists arguing.
Exactly. Traditional scholars like those at Deoband and the Barelvi movement were trying to build walls to preserve classical piety, while modernists like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan were pushing the community to learn English.
To adopt Western education and just accommodate the new rulers?
Yeah, so imagine living inside that pressure cooker.
It must have been suffocating.
And right in the middle of it, in a rural agricultural village called Qadiani, we find the figure at the center of our discussion today.
Mirza Ghulam Ahmad.
Yes, and his background tells us a lot about the psychology of that era. He was born around 1835 to a family of Mughal aristocratic lineage.
Oh, so his ancestors were wealthy.
Very wealthy, powerful landowners. But by the time he was born, they had lost the vast majority of their land and influence.
Confiscated by the Sikh Empire first.
Right. And then further diminished under the British. So he grew up surrounded by the inherited memory of nobility.
Hearing stories of a golden age.
Exactly. Of his family's past greatness, which stood in stark contrast to the reality of living in a diminished, politically powerless state.
That kind of contrast shapes a person. It has to.
It absolutely does. Now, he received traditional home tutoring in Arabic, Persian, the Quran, and Hadith, but he never went through the formal, rigorous madrasa system.
Like the traditional scholars of Deoband did.
Right. He was largely self-taught in his later years, and during the 1860s, he took a job as a junior government clerk in the city of Sialkot.
And Sialkot was a major hub for Christian missionary activity at the time.
It was. So he spent a lot of his time there interacting heavily with these missionaries, engaging in informal debates, observing their methods, studying their arguments.
He was basically doing field research.
Pretty much. And he walked away from Sialkot convinced that Islam needed a modern champion, a defender who could use rational argumentation rather than traditional dogma to refute these external attacks.
So then in 1880, he steps onto the public stage. He publishes the first volume of this massive work called Barihin-i Ahmadiyya.
And the reaction to this book is fascinating because when it first came out, the traditional Muslim scholars actually embraced it enthusiastically.
Wait, really? They praised it?
Oh, absolutely. It was celebrated as a brilliant, robust defense of Islam. It provided very sophisticated counter-arguments against Hindu and Christian polemics.
So at this stage, he's just viewed as a highly skilled apologist.
Exactly. He was fighting back, utilizing what he termed the jihad of the pen. And for a Muslim community that felt intellectually and politically battered, a man who could articulate a strong, rational defense of their faith looked like a hero.
You know, I often think about his trajectory using like a legal analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a community under siege, facing a massive lawsuit that threatens their very existence. They hire this brilliant defense attorney.
Right.
And this attorney fights passionately for them, using all his intellect to defend the law and protect the community. The people love him. But slowly, over the years, the defense attorney decides that merely defending the law is not enough.
He wants more authority.
Exactly. He starts to claim that he is actually the judge. And then a few years later, he stands up and claims that he is the lawgiver himself.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
Right. How does a community process a shift like that? Because this transformation in his claims did not happen overnight.
No, taking that analogy further, imagine the confusion in the courtroom when the attorney starts rewriting the penal code from the bench. It was highly incremental, which is precisely why it caused such deep confusion and eventually a schism.
So walk us through that timeline.
Sure. So 2 years after that first universally praised book in 1882, he claimed to be a mujaddid.
Which in classical Islamic tradition is a centennial reformer, right?
Exactly. There's a belief that God raises a scholar at the turn of every century to revive the faith and clear away innovations.
Now, claiming to be a mujaddid is certainly a bold statement of self-importance.
Oh, definitely.
But it doesn't place a person outside the boundaries of mainstream Islam. I mean, historical giants like Al-Ghazali or Ahmad Sirhindi are widely recognized by the community as mujaddids. It's a respected, orthodox category.
A highly respected category, but it was only the first step. By 1889, he took a more formal step by establishing his own distinct community.
He gathered followers.
Yeah, about 40 followers in the city of Ludhiana. And he took the bay'ah, which is an oath of spiritual allegiance.
Okay, so he's building a dedicated following.
Right. And then came the major escalation. In 1891, he published works like Izala-i-Aham, where he publicly declared himself to be the promised Messiah and the Mahdi.
Wow. That is a colossal theological leap.
It really is.
I mean, he took two distinct eschatological figures from Islamic tradition. The Mahdi, who the texts describe as a leader from the prophet's lineage who will unite the Muslims,
Right.
and the Messiah, who is understood to be Jesus, the son of Mary, returning physically. And he told his followers, actually, I am the fulfillment of both of these prophecies.
Both at the same time. But as profound as that leap was, it still wasn't the final destination. Throughout the late 1890s and culminating around 1901, his claims crystallized into an explicit assertion of prophethood, or nubuwah.
He claimed to be a prophet.
Yes, though he qualified this claim, he stated he was a subordinate or non-law-bearing prophet, a shadow reflecting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
But the core of it is still a claim to prophethood.
Exactly, because the crucial factor was his assertion that he was receiving divine revelation, wahi, and that believing in him and his revelation was mandatory for salvation.
We really have to pause here and look at the environment that allowed this escalation to occur. Because if a person stood up in the middle of a traditional Islamic empire,
Say, under the Ottomans in Istanbul,
or under the peak of the Mughal Empire in Delhi, and claimed to be a prophet receiving new revelation, the state would intervene immediately.
without a doubt, the classical laws regarding apostasy and blasphemy would be enforced.
But Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was making these claims under the protection of the British Raj.
And that colonial legal framework was the incubator. After the trauma of the 1857 mutiny, the British adopted a general policy of religious non-intervention.
As long as you didn't cause trouble.
Exactly. As long as a religious group didn't threaten public order, incite violence, or rebel against the state, the British allowed them to operate freely.
So they essentially dismantled the traditional Islamic legal mechanisms that would have suppressed heterodox theological claims.
Yes. They created a secular space where religious innovation was protected by the military power of the colonial state.
And it seems like the relationship went beyond just passive protection. There was distinct alignment of interests, especially regarding the concept of jihad.
Oh, absolutely. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad wrote extensively about jihad, and his stance was incredibly favorable to the colonial administration. He argued that armed jihad against the British was completely forbidden.
Completely forbidden. How did he justify that?
His theological reasoning was that because the British allowed freedom of preaching and religious practice, the necessary conditions for a defensive armed jihad simply did not exist. He had his followers that the only permitted struggle in this modern era was the jihad of the pen.
Which, if you put yourself in the shoes of a British colonial administrator, is exactly what you want to hear.
Right. I mean, you are perpetually terrified of another violent Muslim uprising, and suddenly a religious movement emerges within the Muslim community that preaches absolute loyalty to the crown, pacifism, and the theological illegitimacy of armed rebellion.
It was a highly convenient theology for the rulers.
Very convenient.
But for the mainstream Muslim community, that abrogation of physical jihad, even as a defensive concept to protect their lands, coupled with the escalating claims of prophethood, it pushed the situation past the breaking point.
It did. And this brings us to the absolute core of our discussion today, the theological fault line that defines this entire controversy.
The concept of Khatam an-Nubuwah, the seal of the prophets.
Yes. Understanding why the global Muslim scholarly consensus spanning every single school of thought, Sunni and Shia, traditionalist and modernist, rejects the Ahmadiyya movement, requires a deep examination of this single concept.
Khatam an-Nubuwah.
Right. In Surah Al-Ahzab, the 33rd chapter of the Quran, verse 40 explicitly states, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets.
And for over 1,400 years, mainstream Islamic scholarship has understood that verse as an absolute locked and closed door.
Yes. Classical Arabic lexicography is intensely precise regarding this word. When you open foundational dictionaries like Lisan al-Arab or Taj al-Arus, the root KHTM from which Khatam is derived refers to the seal that closes a vessel, a pouch, or a letter.
It signifies completion.
Absolute completion and security. It means the ultimate end, the final part of a thing. When a vessel is sealed, it means nothing more can be poured into it and nothing can be taken out.
So mainstream scholars, building on the unbroken consensus of the earliest generations of Muslims, argue that this signifies both chronological finality,
Meaning no prophet will come after him in time.
And qualitative finality, meaning the institution of prophethood itself has reached its perfection and concluded.
Exactly.
Think about it like a software operating system. The original developers write the code, they refine it, they perfect it, and then they lock the code and apply a digital seal.
It becomes a closed system.
Right. No new foundational code can be added. You can have scholars and reformers who explain the code, who teach people how to use the software better, but no one is allowed to write new core programming.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But the Ahmadiyya theology looks at that exact same word, katam, and extracts a completely different definition. How do they navigate the linguistics of that verse?
They argue that katam does not mean the last in a chronological sense. Instead, they interpret it to mean the best, the ultimate ornament, or an authenticating seal.
An authenticating seal.
Yeah, their proposition is that Prophet Muhammad is the supreme prophet, the highest peak of spiritual perfection, and his seal acts almost like a stamp of approval or a spiritual mold.
So they don't believe the door is closed.
Right. Therefore, they argue, the door to prophethood is not bolted shut. Future prophets can still appear, provided they do not bring a new law, and provided they perfectly follow and reflect the law of Muhammad. They claim these subsequent prophets are authenticated by his seal.
So they essentially divide the concept of prophethood into two distinct categories. They talk about tashri prophethood, meaning a legislative prophet who brings a new divine law, like Moses or Muhammad.
And then they talk about tashri prophethood, a non-legislative prophet who brings no new law, but simply revives, purifies, and reflects the existing law.
But where does this idea of a non-legislative prophet even come from?
To build the intellectual architecture for this, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad borrowed heavily from the complex metaphysics of classical Sufism.
Oh, like Ibn Arabi.
Exactly, particularly the concepts found in the works of the Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi. He utilized terms like zil, which translates to shadow, and buruz, which means a reflexive manifestation or projection.
A shadow prophet.
Right. He claimed his station was that of a shadow prophet. He was not an independent, standalone prophet. He claimed to be a perfect spiritual reflection of the Prophet Muhammad, polished to such a degree that the divine light reflected off him, granting him the title of prophet.
The mainstream scholarly reaction to this use of terminology is fascinating because they essentially argue you are taking the poetic, spiritual vocabulary of the Sufis, but you are applying a completely foreign, literal grammar to it.
Exactly. Mainstream scholars look at the history of Sufism and point out that, yes, great mystics like Ibn Arabi certainly spoke in lofty terms about spiritual elevation. They wrote extensively about saints, or awliya, receiving divine inspiration, or ilham.
They discuss the concept of the perfect man.
Right. But those classical Sufis drew a rigid, impenetrable, fortified wall between sainthood and prophethood. No classical Sufi ever claimed the actual title of Nabi or prophet for themselves.
They never crossed that line.
Never. They never claimed that the spiritual inspirations they received in their hearts were wahi nubuwah, prophetic revelation that is legally binding on the entire community of believers.
So the mainstream critique is that Ahmadiyya theology took the metaphorical, deeply spiritual language of the Sufis and weaponized it to claim a literal juridical station of prophethood.
Yes.
Because look, if I stand in front of a mirror, the reflection is my zil, my shadow or image. The reflection might look exactly like me, but the reflection cannot sign a contract.
Right.
The reflection cannot issue a legal command. The Ahmadiyya claim seems to suggest the reflection actually has the authority of the original source.
And that's where the theological friction becomes severe.
And there is a very famous, widely transmitted hadith that directly addresses this finality. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "La nabiyya ba'di," there is no prophet after me.
It is a short, incredibly direct, unambiguous statement.
So how does a debate even arise over the grammar of a sentence that simple?
The entire debate hinges on the Arabic preposition badi, meaning after me. The Ahmadiyya interpretation claims that badi in this specific context means in opposition to me or bringing a law different from mine.
So they're saying he just meant no rival prophets.
Right. They argue the prophet was simply stating that no prophet will ever come who opposes his teaching or tries to replace the Quran.
But classical Arabic grammarians, historians, and the entire tradition of hadith scholarship reject this redefinition completely.
Totally reject it. They point out that bad is a strict temporal adverb. It signifies sequence in time. It simply means after.
And if you look at the historical sources, the mainstream scholars point to the events that occurred immediately following the prophet's death to prove how the earliest Muslims understood that word.
We look at the Riddle Wars.
Exactly. During the time of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, a man from the Yamama region named Musaylima, claimed to be a prophet.
And the fascinating thing about Musaylima is that he didn't reject Islam or the Prophet Muhammad.
He actually wrote to the prophet claiming he was a partner in prophethood, subordinate to him, sharing the burden of the mission.
Yes.
But the companions of the prophet, the people who spoke the language natively, who heard the prophet speak the words La Nabiyya Badi, they did not sit down and ponder, oh, let's investigate if Musaylima is a non-legislative shadow prophet.
No, they didn't.
They mobilized an army and fought him as an apostate.
And that historical event establishes the ijma, the absolute consensus of the Sahaba, the companions. It set the foundational juridical precedent for Islamic history. Claiming prophethood of any kind or following someone who claims prophethood after Muhammad places one entirely outside the fold of Islam.
The early community understood that the door was sealed shut, without exception.
But the Ahmadiyya literature often brings up another hadith regarding the prophet's son, Ibrahim, who tragically died in infancy.
Right. The prophet was weeping over his son, and it was said, if he had lived, he would have been a prophet.
And Ahmadiyya theologians use this statement to suggest the door to prophethood is technically still open, that the potential for a prophet to exist remains.
But mainstream scholars look at the exact same statement and point out that it is a conditional sentence. It's a what-if scenario.
The undeniable reality is that Ibrahim did not live.
Exactly. Mainstream theology argues that his tragic death in infancy actually served a profound theological purpose, ensuring the absolute finality of his father's mission. There would be no lineage of prophets. There would be no inheritance of the mantle.
The seal was placed, physically and spiritually.
Altering the definition of the seal of the prophets isn't just an academic debate happening in the dusty corners of a library. It isn't just a disagreement over tafsir.
No, it fundamentally alters the entire structural integrity of the religion.
Because if a new prophet is recognized, even if you call him a non-legislative shadow prophet, you instantly create a new center of gravity for the faith.
This is why classical scholars view it as an alteration of the foundational grammar of Islam itself. In Islamic theology, if a person is recognized as a genuine Nabi, a prophet receiving direct divine revelation, then absolute obedience to that person is required.
It's not optional.
Not at all. If you reject a true prophet, you are rejecting the messenger of God, and therefore you are rejecting God. By claiming prophethood, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad effectively made belief in himself a condition of faith.
The authority to interpret scripture, to guide the community, to define what is true and false, it shifts entirely to him and to his successors.
It is no longer just a difference of opinion within the House of Islam. It becomes a completely different dispensation. You are building a new house.
So let's follow that thought into another major theological fault line. Because the claims of prophethood are intimately tied to their understanding of Christology, their understanding of Jesus or Isa, peace be upon him.
And the differences between mainstream Islam and Ahmadiyya theology regarding Jesus are vast and stark.
They are diametrically opposed to one another. I mean, mainstream Islamic belief is grounded in Surah An-Nisa, verses 157 and 158.
Right.
The Quran explicitly states that the enemies of Jesus did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them.
And it continues, rather, Allah raised him to himself.
Based on this and numerous authentic hadith, mainstream Islam teaches that Jesus was raised bodily to heaven without dying, and that he will physically return to earth near the end of times as a just ruler to defeat the Antichrist.
So, no death on the cross, a physical bodily ascension, and a future physical return. That's the mainstream view.
Right. So what is the Ahmadiyya theological narrative?
The Ahmadiyya view centers on what historians often call the swoon theory. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad taught that Jesus was indeed placed on the cross by the Romans, but he did not die there.
He survived it.
Yes. The trauma of the crucifixion caused him to fall into a deep swoon, like a coma-like state. He was taken down from the cross alive, hidden in the tomb where he healed from his severe wounds using a special ointment.
And then what?
And then he secretly fled the region, migrating to the east to preach to the lost tribes of Israel.
He traveled across the ancient world all the way to India.
Specifically to the Kashmir Valley. Ahmadi theology claims that Jesus lived a long, peaceful life there, continuing his ministry and eventually dying a natural death at the age of 120 in the city of Srinagar.
And they point to a specific physical location today, don't they? The Rosabal Shrine in Srinagar.
Yes. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad claimed that this specific tomb which local Kashmiri historical traditions have long attributed to a medieval Sufi saint or a holy man named Yuza Asaf, is actually the final resting place of Jesus of Nazareth.
Have historians looked into this?
Yes. Independent historians, archaeologists, and textual scholars who have evaluated the site find absolutely no contemporary first-century Judean connection. The architectural and historical evidence points to it being a much later medieval tomb.
But for Ahmadiyya theology, establishing this doctrine, the wafat Masih, or the physical death of Jesus, is an absolute non-negotiable necessity.
It's foundational to their system.
Now, if you were sitting there wondering why they care so much about proving Jesus is buried in a tomb in Kashmir, it all connects back to the core claim. Why focus so much intellectual energy on a medieval shrine?
Because if Jesus is dead and buried in the soil of Kashmir, he cannot physically return from heaven in the end times. A physical descent on the Kleins becomes impossible.
I see.
Therefore, all the Islamic prophecies found in the Hadith literature about the return of the Messiah must be interpreted metaphorically.
It clears the path.
Exactly. Proving the death of Jesus paves the theological runway for Mirza Ghulam Ahmad to stand up and say, the Messiah you are waiting for is not coming down from the sky. The prophecies were metaphors. I am the spiritual reflection, the buruz of Jesus. I have come in his spirit and power. I am the promised Messiah.
It is a remarkable theological pivot. You take the literal physical events expected by 1,400 years of classical scholarship, the bodily return of Jesus, and you turn them into spiritual metaphors.
Right.
But then, strangely, you take other spiritual metaphors and turn them into hyperliteral physical objects. Look at the white minaret.
The Manaratul Masih. Yeah, there is a famous, detailed classical hadith stating that when Jesus returns, he will descend at the white minaret in the eastern part of Damascus.
And what did Mirza Ghulam Ahmad do with that?
To fulfill this specific prophecy, he literally ordered the construction of a white minaret inside his compound in Qadian. He argued geographically that Qadian is located to the east of Damascus.
Well, technically true.
And by residing there and building this physical brick-and-mortar structure, the prophecy was perfectly fulfilled.
So the physical descent of a human being from heaven becomes a metaphor, but the white minaret becomes a literal construction project in rural Punjab.
Yes. And this process of metaphorizing extends to the entire eschatology, the entire narrative of the end times, doesn't it?
Completely. Everything is reinterpreted to fit the geopolitical reality of the 19th century. Take the concept of the Dajjal, the Antichrist.
Mainstream Islam expects a literal physical deceiver, a one-eyed man who will travel the earth spreading chaos and false miracles.
Right, but Ahmadiyya theology interprets the Dajjal purely metaphorically. They view it as a massive, deceptive system. Specifically, the system of Western materialistic civilization, colonial power, and the global Christian missionary apparatus.
And Gog and Magog, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the chaotic tribes mentioned in the Quran.
Reinterpreted as well, not as hidden, subterranean, or ancient tribes that will break forth, but as the Slavic and Germanic or Anglo-Saxon nations.
Wow.
Yeah, the industrial, military, and political power of these European nations dominating the globe was seen as the fulfillment of Gog and Magog spreading across the earth.
Even the cosmological signs were rationalized. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad claimed that the occurrence of lunar and solar eclipses during the month of Ramadan in 1894 were divine, miraculous signs, specifically validating his claim to be the Mahdi.
But if you ask an astronomer about lunar and solar eclipses occurring in the same month, they would just call it standard orbital mechanics. It happens regularly on a predictable mathematical cycle.
And critics and mainstream scholars immediately pointed that out. These eclipses follow established astronomical cycles. They are not unique, miraculous interruptions of nature.
And didn't the Hadith scholars have something to say about that too?
They did. Classical Hadith scholars scrutinized the specific text he cited to support this eclipse prophecy and classified it as weak, or da'if, if not entirely fabricated. It did not meet the strict criteria of authentication used by mainstream scholarship.
When you lay out this entire architecture of thought, it is incredibly intricate. It is a massive, comprehensive system of reinterpretation.
It really is.
Why did this specific blend? The rationalizing of miracles, the metaphorizing of the end times, the rejection of physical ascensions. Why was it so deeply appealing to certain minds in the 1890s, and why does it still find traction today?
It appeals profoundly to a modern, rationalist mindset that feels deeply uncomfortable with the supernatural.
Because of the scientific advancements of the time.
Exactly. In the face of 19th century scientific advancements, the Industrial Revolution, and harsh European critiques that labeled traditional religion as more superstition and fairy tales, the Ahmadiyya theology offered a version of Islam that seemed to smooth off all the rough supernatural edges.
No physical bodies floating into heaven.
No literal one-eyed monsters wandering the earth. No violent, apocalyptic, sword-wielding battles at the end of the world.
It presented a highly organized, intellectualized, peaceful faith that felt compatible with Victorian modernity.
But the traditional scholars did not see it as a helpful modernization. They saw it as a demolition of the foundational texts.
And the reaction of the ulama, the scholarly establishment, and the reality of ijma, or consensus, is the next crucial piece of the puzzle.
The reaction from the traditional scholars was immediate, and it was unified. And this is a point that requires careful attention.
Why is that?
Because in late 19th century India, the traditional Muslim scholars were deeply, sometimes bitterly, divided among themselves. The Deobandists and the Barelvis were engaged in profound theological warfare over Sufi practices, jurisprudence, and the nature of the Prophet's knowledge.
They debated each other constantly.
Constantly. Yet, when Mirza Ghulam Ahmad announced his claims to messianism and ultimately prophethood, those intense internal divides evaporated almost overnight on this specific issue.
They actually united to issue formal legal rulings, or fatwas, against him.
Scholars from across the entire theological spectrum came together. Leading figures from the Deoband seminary, alongside fierce opponents like the Barelvi leader, Imam Muhammad Raza Khan, found themselves in total agreement.
Didn't Imam Ahmad Raza Khan even travel for this?
He did. He traveled to Mecca and Medina to present Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's writings to the senior scholars of the Arab world, gathering their endorsements for his text, Husam al-Haramain.
And what was the conclusion?
The conclusion was unanimous. They issued fatwas of takfir, formally declaring the movement and its founder to be outside the fold of Islam.
Now, the word takfir carries immense weight. Excommunication is not a tool that traditional scholars use lightly. There are strict rules against declaring a Muslim to be a non-believer.
Extremely strict rules.
So why did they feel it was absolutely necessary in this case?
They invoked the concept of dora, the necessity of faith. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, the religion is not just a loose collection of ideas, it has a defined boundary.
There are certain foundational tenets.
Yes, tenets that are so clearly, explicitly established by the Quran, and so universally understood through the continuous, unbroken transmission of the entire community from the time of the Prophet.
Which is a concept called tawatur, right?
Exactly, and because of that tawatur, they form the absolute, undeniable bedrock of the religion. The finality of prophethood is one of these absolute necessities.
So, to deny the finality of prophethood is not viewed like having a disagreement over where to place your hands during prayer or a debate over the technicalities of Islamic finance.
Not at all. Altering a dora is viewed by classical jurisprudence not as a minor sectarian difference, but as a total departure from the religion itself. It crosses a red line.
It changes the core.
Right. The scholarly consensus argues that if you have the authority to change the finality of prophethood, a concept explicitly stated in the Quran and affirmed by the Prophet himself, then you have the authority to change anything in the religion.
The entire structure becomes subjective.
And this unified rejection wasn't just a localized 19th century reaction in India. This consensus has held firm and solidified globally throughout the modern era.
It is arguably one of the very few theological issues where the entire global Ummah Sunni, Shia, Salafi, Sufi, traditionalist, modernist is in complete unanimous agreement.
We see this manifested in major institutional and state declarations throughout the 20th century. For instance, in Pakistan, after severe anti-Ahmadiyya riots, the government commissioned the 1954 Munir Report.
What did that report find?
That extensive legal investigation highlighted the unbridgeable theological gap regarding prophethood as the root cause of the friction.
And the consensus was formalized on a global scale in the 1970s.
Yes. The Muslim World League, the Rabita Alama Islami, convened a massive, unprecedented conference in Mecca in 1974.
Who was there?
Scholars representing 140 Muslim countries and countless organizations debated the issue and unanimously passed a resolution declaring the Ahmadiyya movement to be a non-Muslim entity due to their beliefs regarding prophethood.
And this global theological declaration was followed shortly by political action in Pakistan. Specifically, the Second Constitutional Amendment in 1974, and later Ordinance XX in 1984.
Which legally restricted Ahmadiyya members from identifying themselves as Muslims, calling their places of worship mosques, or using Islamic terminology in public within Pakistan.
We need to reflect carefully on this. As we mentioned, takfir is an incredibly heavy burden. It has severe social, personal, and sometimes legal implications.
It does.
But there is a vital nuance in classical Islamic scholarship that often gets lost in the political noise and the newspaper headlines.
The nuance is everything. Classical intellectual giants like Imam al-Ghazali were incredibly strict about defending the theological boundaries of Islam. They wrote extensively on what constitutes disbelief.
But they also deeply recognized the limits of human judgment.
Yes. The classical orthodox position is that Islamic law, the Sharia, must judge the outward, public claims made by an individual or a group.
If a group publicly professes a doctrine that explicitly contradicts a dara of faith,
then the scholars and the law must classify them accordingly in order to maintain the communal and creedal boundaries in this world.
they have to protect the definition of the religion so that it doesn't lose all meaning.
Exactly. You must define what Islam is and what it is not. However, the ultimate judgment of an individual's soul, the sincerity of their heart, their ignorance, and their ultimate fate in the hereafter, that jurisdiction belongs entirely and exclusively to Allah.
That's a really important point.
And furthermore, and this is absolutely vital to state clearly, establishing a theological boundary does not negate the Islamic requirement for justice, compassion, and the protection of basic human rights.
Right. Maintaining an orthodox creed does not grant anyone permission to engage in persecution, harassment, or vigilante violence against those they consider outside the faith.
That is a crucial distinction to make. Theological clarity must not be conflated with hatred or violence.
But while the mainstream Muslim community was drawing these firm boundaries, the Ahmadiyya movement itself was not static. They were undergoing a profound internal evolution.
Because Mirza Ghulam Ahmad passed away in 1908.
And he was succeeded by a close companion, Hakim Nuruddin. But when Nuruddin died in 1914, the movement faced a massive crisis and fractured.
The schism of 1914 is a fascinating case study in sociology. The community split into two distinct branches over the exact nature of their founders' claims.
So what were the two groups?
Well, the majority group, which remained based in the town of Qadiani, maintained the hardline position that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was indeed a prophet. They formally elected his son, Mirza Bashir ud-Din Mahmud Ahmad, to serve as the second caliph.
And they became known as the Qadiani branch.
Exactly, and they represent the vast majority of the movement today.
So what happened to the minority who disagreed?
The minority group relocated to the city of Lahore, forming the Lahori branch, led by Maulana Muhammad Ali, who was a prominent intellectual.
And what was their theological stance?
They argued that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad never actually claimed literal prophethood. They asserted he was only a mujaddid, a reformer, and that his frequent use of the word prophet in his writings was purely metaphorical and linguistic.
So they attempted to position themselves much closer to mainstream Sunni orthodoxy to avoid the charge of heresy and takfir.
Yes.
But their attempt to reconcile with the mainstream scholarly establishment didn't work, did it?
No, because even if they downgraded his title to reformer, they still believed he received divine inspiration that must guide the community, and they still held on to the metaphorical interpretations of Jesus and the end times.
The mainstream consensus remained firm that both branches placed themselves outside the fold.
Right. And while the Lahori branch slowly dwindled in numbers and influence, the Qadiani branch embarked on a masterclass in what sociologists, drawing from Max Weber, call routinizing charisma.
Routinizing charisma. That is such a descriptive phrase.
It is, isn't it?
You take the explosive, unpredictable, fiery energy of a charismatic founder, and when that founder dies, you have to transform that energy into a stable, enduring bureaucracy, or the movement collapses. How did the Qadiani branch achieve this?
They established the institution of the Ahmadiyya Khilafat. They created a formalized electoral college known as the Majlis-e-Intikhab-e-Khilafat.
And what was their job?
They were tasked with selecting a supreme, lifelong leader, the Khalifa. Now, it is important to distinguish this from the classical Sunni concept of the Khilafat, which historically implies political, territorial, and military leadership over the entire global Muslim ummah.
The Ahmadiyya Khilafat is entirely different.
Very different. It is an internal, administrative, and spiritual headship solely for their specific community.
They basically created a spiritual CEO to manage the organization.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And looking at the history since 1914, every single Khalifa selected by this electoral college has been from the direct family lineage of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad.
It has functioned effectively as a familial dynasty, ensuring continuous, unbroken authority.
And to support this institution, the second Khalifa built incredibly robust, demanding economic and social structures. One of the most significant pillars of their organizational strength is the al-Wasiyat system, or the will.
Which was actually initiated by the founder shortly before his death, right?
Yes.
This is the system where members pledge a significant portion of their wealth to the central movement.
Yes. Members who opt into the al-Wasiyat system sign a pledge committing between 1/10 and 1/3 of their total lifetime income and their eventual estate assets directly to the movement.
1/3. That is massive.
In exchange for this profound level of financial devotion, they are granted burial rights in a specific, highly revered cemetery originally established in Qadiani called the Behishti Maqbara, or the Heavenly Graveyard.
Think about the sociological power of that mechanism. You are intricately tying a person's spiritual salvation and their eternal burial rights to a concrete, lifelong financial contribution to the central organization.
It creates an incredibly well-funded, highly disciplined, and deeply committed community.
And they needed every ounce of that discipline, because geopolitics was about to uproot them and force them onto the global stage.
The partition of British India in 1947 changed their trajectory forever.
Because their holy city of Qadian ended up on the Indian side of the border.
Right. And the Ahmadi leadership, who had generally supported the political creation of Pakistan, migrated en masse across the new border. They purchased a barren, desolate stretch of land in Punjab, Pakistan, and built an entirely new, self-contained headquarters town from scratch.
And they called it Rabwa.
Rabwa.
But Rabwa did not remain a safe, quiet haven for long. As we discussed earlier, the political climate in Pakistan turned fiercely against them.
With the 1974 constitutional amendments and the severe restrictions of Ordinance XX in 1984.
It made it legally impossible and often physically dangerous for them to operate openly, print their literature, or practice their faith publicly in Pakistan.
That legal persecution triggered a massive, sustained wave of asylum seeking. Facing the threat of arrest under Ordinance X, the fourth Khalifa migrated to London in 1984.
That move shifted the absolute center of gravity of the movement from South Asia to the West.
And it is in this Western context that we see the birth of their modern global diaspora and the deployment of their highly sophisticated missionary engine.
If you live in a major Western city like London, Frankfurt, Toronto, or Washington, D.C., you have likely seen their outreach. They're incredibly organized.
Very polished.
Their public relations strategies are highly effective. You see their primary slogan plastered on buses, billboards, and flyers. Love for all, hatred for none.
It is a brilliant, highly calculated branding strategy. By emphasizing universal human rights, peace, tolerance, and modernity, they position themselves to Western governments, media outlets, and interfaith councils as the ultimate moderate face of Islam.
They appeal directly to a secular Western society that is often highly anxious about Islamic extremism and political violence.
Exactly. They present a version of Islam that is entirely non-threatening to the secular state.
They also leverage media technology beautifully. I mean, long before the internet revolutionized communication, they established MTA Muslim television Ahmadiyya in 1994.
MTA was the first global Islamic satellite channel. It was a visionary move.
Because it let them bypass the national censorship and legal restrictions of countries like Pakistan entirely. It allowed the Khalifa sitting in London to broadcast his Friday sermons directly into the living rooms of followers in remote villages in Africa, apartments in Germany, and homes in Canada simultaneously.
It acts as a powerful digital glue, holding a scattered diaspora together under one voice.
They also heavily utilize humanitarian branding. They operate organizations like Humanity First,
which do genuine, large-scale disaster relief, build water wells, and construct infrastructure, particularly in West Africa.
Right. And through these efforts, they have gained millions of followers by stepping in and filling the gaps in state services with hospitals and schools. And on the intellectual front, they have been engaging Western academics and intellectuals for over a century, with the Review of Religions magazine presenting their theology using philosophical, academic language.
But sociologists who study the movement point out a fascinating paradox here.
What's that?
To survive and grow as a high-tension minority religious group in a secular, pluralistic society, you absolutely must engage outwardly. You must have the charity walks and the public outreach.
But simultaneously, you must build massive, impenetrable walls internally.
If you don't, your youth will simply assimilate and disappear into the surrounding secular culture within a generation or two.
So how do they accomplish that? How do they maintain such strict boundaries and keep their youth deeply engaged when the theological differences with mainstream Islam are so complex and nuanced?
They achieve this by building what sociologists call total institutions. They use highly structured auxiliary groups to organize every single stage of a member's life, leaving very little room for outside influence.
Like the Qudam ul Ahmadiyya.
Exactly. The organization for young men between the ages of 15 and 40 is intensely disciplined. It focuses on mandatory community service, physical fitness, and rigorous doctrinal defense.
And the women's organization.
The Lajnat Umayyah organizes the women, maintaining internal educational networks and fostering deep loyalty to the caliphate.
And there is even a formalized program that claims a child before they are even born, the Wafi Now system.
In the Wafi Now program, parents can formally dedicate their children to the service of the movement before birth. These dedicated children receive specialized intensive training from a very young age,
with the expectation that they will grow up to become full-time missionaries, doctors, or professionals, working exclusively for the Jamaat, the community.
Right.
What happens if someone inside this tight-knit ecosystem dissents? What if a young person questions the theology, reads mainstream literature, or challenges the authority of the Khalifa?
Internal dissent is monitored very closely. The ultimate sanction for challenging the theology or the leadership is formal excommunication from the Jamaat.
And that's not just a spiritual removal, is it?
No, it often entails a total social boycott by all other members, which can include immediate family members, parents, and siblings. Losing your entire social, familial, and economic network overnight is a terrifying prospect.
It is a powerful deterrent that maintains strict internal cohesion.
It really is.
Looking at this from the outside, it feels very much like they have constructed a state within a state. They integrate beautifully into the public sphere. They hold charity walks, they organize blood drives, they win peace prizes, they invite politicians to their conventions.
But internally, the theological walls and the rules regarding endogamous marrying strictly within the community are incredibly high.
It makes me wonder about the young mainstream Muslim growing up in London or Toronto today. How do they navigate a conversation with an Ahmadi peer in university?
Because the external vocabulary sounds completely identical.
Exactly. They both say mosque, Quran, prophet, jihad, and salah. But the internal dictionary defining those words is entirely different.
And this specific linguistic challenge is exactly what mainstream Islamic Dawah organizations and youth groups are focusing on today. They are shifting away from purely emotional debates and moving toward rigorous comparative religion training.
They are teaching young Muslims not just to argue loudly, but to spot the subtle linguistic shifts.
For instance, they teach youth to compare Ahmadiyya English translations of the Quran side by side with classical translations, to see precisely where theological biases regarding the death of Jesus or the nature of the seal of the prophets have been subtly inserted into the English text.
It forces mainstream youth to stop taking their religion for granted. You can't just inherit your faith as a cultural artifact anymore.
You have to actually learn your own Aqidah, your own creed, much more deeply. You have to know precisely what you believe, why you believe it, and how the classical scholars understood the texts.
The presence and active proselytization of the Ahmadiyya movement in the West actually acts as a powerful catalyst for mainstream Muslims.
It forces them to return to the classical texts, to understand the meticulous science of hadith authentication, to study the principles of Quranic exegesis, and to grasp the historical reality and binding nature of the Ijma, the consensus of the early generations.
It transforms passive believers into educated defenders of their faith.
We have covered an immense amount of ground in this conversation. We journeyed from the trauma and epistemological crisis of colonial Punjab to the theological pivot of prophethood.
We explored the reinterpretation of the Messiah, the unwavering unified response to the global scholarly consensus, and finally, the modern sociological machinery of a highly organized global diaspora.
It is a deeply complex, incredibly sensitive, and heavily layered history. As we wrap up this conversation, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder.
Please do.
Consider how deeply language shapes our reality. The Ahmadiyya movement utilizes the exact vocabulary forged by 1,400 years of Islamic tradition. They use words like prophet, revelation, messiah, and jihad. Yet by subtly altering the underlying grammar, the historical context, and the classical definitions of these words, an entirely different worldview, an entirely different religious structure is constructed. It forces every single one of us to ask ourselves, how deeply do we actually understand the precise definitions of the faith we claim to follow?
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.